I still remember the first time I saw Clint Eastwood up close. He was sitting alone on a wooden bench outside his ranch, a faded hat tilted just low enough to hide most of his face. The world had moved on. Younger stars had taken over, the lights had dimmed, and the papers had stopped writing about him. But there he was, watching the California sky like a man waiting for something that never came. At that time, I was just a caretaker, hired to keep things running, to make sure the old ranch didn't crumble with the years. I didn't expect to speak to him much. I didn't expect him to even remember my name. But the truth is, I saw more of Clint Eastwood than most people ever did. Not the legend, not the cowboy, just the man. People always talk about fame like it's gold, but no one tells you what happens when the shine fades, when silence fills the rooms where applause used to live. I used to think loneliness was something that happened to people who had no one, but I learned that sometimes the loneliest man in the world can still be the most famous one. Clint wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He was quiet. He'd walk the fields in the morning mist, feeding the horses himself, humming old Western tunes under his breath. Some days, he'd talk about the movies, not the awards, not the money, but the moments that almost broke him. And other days, he'd just stare at the horizon and say nothing at all. I didn't know then that I'd spend years caring for him, through silence, through storms, through moments that would change me forever. I didn't know that the man I once admired more than anyone would one day forget I even existed. But before all that, there was peace, and sometimes I wish I could go back to those mornings. When the air was cold, the light was golden, and Clint Eastwood still remembered my name. When I first started working at the ranch, I didn't even know if Clint Eastwood lived there full-time. The job listing didn't say much, just caretaker needed for a private property in Carmel Valley. I thought it was just another gig, mowing lawns, fixing fences, feeding animals. I'd been doing that kind of work for years. It wasn't until my second day, when I was trimming the rose bushes near the porch, that I saw him. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood stepped outside wearing a flannel shirt, boots older than me, and that same quiet expression you'd see in his movies. For a second I froze. My shears hung midair. He nodded once. "Morning," he said. That was it. Just one word. But his voice carried that slow, gravelly calm that made every line in his films feel like scripture. "Morning, sir," I replied. He gave a small half-smile, almost like he wasn't used to being called sir. After that, I kept my distance, not out of fear, more out of respect. Clint wasn't the kind of man who needed attention. His silence spoke more than most people's words ever could. Still, I noticed things. Every morning, he'd sit by the same window with a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream. At noon, he'd walk down the gravel path to the stables, brushing his horse himself, talking to it like an old friend. And every evening, he'd play a few chords on his worn-out piano before heading to bed. It was a rhythm, slow, almost sacred. A few weeks in, I started fixing little things without being asked, tightening a loose gate latch, repainting the barn door, clearing the path of fallen branches after a storm. One evening, when I was sweeping the porch, he opened the door and looked at me. "You work quiet," he said. I smiled. "You too?" For the first time, I heard him laugh, soft, short, like something that had been sleeping for a while. From that day on, something changed. He'd ask about my family sometimes, not out of politeness, but like he actually cared. I told him I had a daughter who lived with her mother up north and that I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. He didn't say much in return, but he nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Sometimes," he murmured, "life gives you more scenes than you ever planned to act." I didn't know what he meant then, But I do now. Over the next few months, our small talks became routine. I'd bring him his mail in the morning, and he'd ask if the horses were eating well. Sometimes he'd tell me stories, half memories, half confessions, like the time he shot Unforgiven and said he almost quit halfway through, or when he directed $1 Million Baby and couldn't sleep for weeks because of how heavy the story felt. He said the hardest thing about movies wasn't the acting. It was leaving the world you built behind. He told me once, "People think I love the camera. Truth is, I just love telling the truth, even when it hurts." That night, I sat in my small cabin near the stables and thought about how strange it was. A man who had lived larger than life, now quietly watching sunsets no one else saw. Fame had become a ghost in his house. You could feel it in the walls, the silence of old applause. I remember one rainy evening, I found him sitting in the barn with an old photo in his hand. I didn't mean to intrude, but he waved me over. It was a picture of him on set, younger, stronger, surrounded by people smiling at him. He handed it to me and said, "They all said they'd call." None of them ever did. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, the rain tapping softly on the tin roof. After a moment, he said, "You're lucky, you know. You still have time to be remembered by the right people." Something in his tone made me think, maybe he wasn't talking about fame. Maybe he meant love. From that day, I made it a point to stay, not just as a worker, but as someone who'd listen. Because sometimes the people the world remembers are the ones who feel the most forgotten. And though Clint Eastwood never said it out loud, I could tell he appreciated the quiet company, the coffee on cold mornings, the fixed fences, the presence of someone who wasn't there to take a picture. It wasn't a friendship in the usual sense. It was something slower, deeper, two souls sharing the same silence. The winter that year came early. The mornings were colder, the light thinner, and Clint had started spending more time indoors. The old piano stayed untouched. The horses grew restless, sensing something in the air, that quiet shift before everything changes. At first, I thought it was just the weather, but then I noticed something else. He'd stopped greeting me in the mornings. His coffee would go cold on the table. The same man who once shared small stories now looked past me, as if I were just another shadow on his porch. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost invisible, like watching a painting fade in real time. One day, I knocked on the door to remind him about his doctor's appointment. He opened it, eyes cloudy with confusion. "Who are you again?" he asked quietly. For a second, I thought he was joking, but then I saw it. The hesitation, the uncertainty. It cut deeper than I expected. "I'm Sam," I said softly. "Your caretaker." He blinked, then nodded slowly as if trying to pull the memory out of somewhere buried. "Right, Sam?" Of course he smiled, but it was the kind of smile people give when they're pretending to remember. That night, I sat alone outside the barn, staring at the empty porch light. The wind was cold, but not as cold as the realization settling in my chest. Clint Eastwood, the man whose face had been known to millions, was starting to forget the small world right in front of him. Over the next few weeks, it got worse. He'd call me Mike some days, Tom on others. Once, he even asked if I'd seen the new guy who works here. There was no new guy, just me. But I stayed patient. I told myself it was age, exhaustion, maybe stress. I'd seen people lose bits of themselves before. It always happens quietly, like the slow peeling of paint on an old wall. One evening, I found him outside, standing by the fence, staring at the horizon. "You ever think about how time just slips?" he asked. "All the time," I replied. He turned to me with a faint grin. "Don't." "It's a bad habit," he said it lightly, but his eyes gave him away. Tired, uncertain, lonely. Sometimes I'd find letters in his study, handwritten, unsent, names I didn't recognize. Some started with "Dear" and stopped midway as if the words had disappeared halfway through. Once, I found a half-finished letter that began, "Greater than, to whoever still remembers me, thank you." I didn't have the heart to read further. It wasn't all sorrow, though. There were moments, brief flickers, where the old Clint would shine through. Like when the horses broke loose one stormy night and he rushed out barefoot in the rain to help me catch them. His face lit up with that same grit from his younger days. The same man who'd stared down outlaws on screen, now chasing frightened animals through mud. We laughed that night, drenched to the bone. When it was over, he looked at me and said, "Guess we both still got some fight left." For a second, he was him again. But the next morning, he didn't remember it. He saw me cleaning his boots and asked if I'd borrowed them. That was the moment it truly hit me. How fragile memory is. How cruel time can be. I started keeping a small notebook of things we did together. Repairs, rides, small moments of laughter, so I could remind him when he asked. But reading them back to him felt like reading to a stranger about another man's life. One afternoon, I came into the kitchen and found him sitting by the window, a photo album open in front of him. He was staring at a picture of himself holding an award. "I used to know this man," he said softly. "He looks like me, doesn't he?" My throat tightened. "He is you, Clint." He turned to me with a blank expression, then looked back at the photo. "He seems tired." After that, he began to withdraw more. Meals untouched, conversations shorter, eyes wandering somewhere far away. I'd try to spark something familiar, mention an old film, a favorite line, even a melody from one of his soundtracks. But his responses grew faint. Still, I stayed, even when he didn't remember my name, even when he started calling me kid like he used to call his actors, because I knew, deep down, that somewhere inside that fading silence, the real Clint Eastwood was still there. The man who loved the land, who fed the horses before dawn, who once told me that truth was the hardest thing to face. And maybe, just maybe, taking care of him wasn't about being remembered. Maybe it was about remembering him when he no longer could. One evening, as I was locking up, he called out to me from the porch. "Hey kid," he said, "you ever get tired of working here?" I turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, half in the golden light of the setting sun. "No, sir," I said. "Not yet." He nodded, smiling faintly. "Good. Then don't." That was the last time he remembered who I was. After that night, something in him slipped quietly away. Not with a storm, not with tears, just a stillness that even the wind seemed to respect. And as much as it hurt, I stayed. Because some promises don't need to be spoken to be kept.
Spring came quietly that year. The hills around the ranch turned green again, and the horses began to graze longer under the warmer light. The world outside seemed alive, but inside the house, time felt frozen. Clint had stopped walking the trails. He'd stopped talking much, too. Most days, he just sat by the window, watching the wind bend the tall grass. I remember one morning early, maybe 6, I brought him his coffee. The cup was warm in my hands, the smell of roasted beans filling the quiet kitchen. He looked at it for a long time before asking, "Who made this?" "I did," I said gently. "Same as always." He nodded, distant. "It's good," he whispered, then turned his gaze back to the window. That was all. Something inside me started to ache, not from being forgotten, but from realizing how far away he'd drifted. I wasn't losing a job. I was losing someone I'd grown to care for. Every once in a while, there'd be moments that gave me hope. A flash of clarity, a spark of the old Clint. Like when the mail arrived one afternoon, a fan letter written by a young film student, I started reading it aloud to him, not expecting much. But halfway through, his eyes lit up. He still remembers that line. Clint asked suddenly. I smiled. Guess he does. He chuckled, low and brief, but real. For a few minutes, we talked about his old films again. His voice carried that same weight, that same steady rhythm. I almost forgot he was sick, but by nightfall, it was gone again. The spark faded, and he asked me if I'd ever met the man who used to live here. That night, I cried in my cabin for the first time. Not loud, just quiet tears that came from the kind of sadness you can't explain. The kind that doesn't shout, but whispers. You've done all you can. A few days later, I got a call from his doctor. He said the symptoms were worsening. The forgetfulness, the disorientation, the confusion. There was nothing they could do now except keep him comfortable. I hung up the phone, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it all. Here was a man who had faced death on screen more times than anyone, and yet, the cruelest ending life could give him was to forget who he was. That evening, I went into his room. He was asleep in his chair, a thin blanket over his knees. The light from the sunset cutting across his face like a scene from one of his own films. I whispered, "You did good, Clint. You really did." He stirred, half awake, and muttered, "Was it worth it?" I froze. What was... He opened his eyes, foggy but still piercing. All of it. The question hung in the air like smoke. Before I could answer, he drifted back to sleep. That one sentence haunted me for days. Was it worth it? The fame, the sacrifice, the loneliness, the price of being a legend. One afternoon, I found him in the barn again, sitting beside his horse, stroking its mane. He looked up at me and said, "You ever loved something so much you forget yourself?" I nodded quietly. "Yeah, my daughter." He smiled sadly. "Then you know how it feels." There was a long silence between us, the kind that says more than words ever could. Then he looked at me, eyes tired, and said, "If I ever forget you too, don't take it personal." I wanted to tell him I wouldn't, but the truth was, I already did. Because every time he called me kid, it was like being erased a little more. Every time he looked through me, I felt smaller, less real. Still, I stayed. I made his meals, helped him dress, read his mail, even replayed his old soundtracks on quiet evenings. Not for nostalgia, but because the music seemed to calm him. One night, the power went out during a storm. The ranch was pitch black except for the faint glow of a lantern. I found him sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. When I approached, he looked up at me with sudden clarity. "Sam," he said. It was the first time in months he'd said my name right. "I remember you," he said softly. I swallowed hard. "You do?" He nodded. "You stayed?" He reached for my hand, something he'd never done before. His grip was weak, trembling, but filled with meaning. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not leaving when the lights went out." For a second, time stopped. The storm faded. The world went still. And in that fragile moment, he was Clint Eastwood again, the man, not the myth. Then his hand slipped away, and his eyes closed. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. When morning came, he didn't recognize me again. The moment was gone like a dream you tried to hold on to, but slips through your fingers as the sun rises. That's when I understood the truth. It wasn't about being forgotten. It was about learning to love without needing to be remembered. Because sometimes, the people we care for the most will never remember what we did for them. But love, real love, leaves its mark quietly, where memory can't touch it. The last time I saw Clint was on a cool autumn evening. The sky above the ranch was dipped in gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory, even while it's still happening. He stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, watching the horses the way he used to watch a movie scene unfold, silently, fully, without hurry. He didn't say much. He never really did. But that evening, something in him felt lighter, as if he'd made peace with the years that had slipped away. I remember walking up beside him, holding 2 mugs of coffee, and handing him one without a word. He took it, smiled faintly, and said, "Still too strong." I laughed. It was the first time in months that felt normal again. He was older now, slower in movement, softer in spirit. But there was a calm in him I hadn't seen before. A man no longer chasing time, but learning to walk with it. I had spent years by his side fixing things, helping with his schedule, making sure he ate when he forgot, listening when he needed silence more than advice. But over time, I began to realize something painful yet freeing. I wasn't meant to stay forever. I was just meant to be part of his story for a while, to walk beside him through one chapter. Then quietly close the page when it was time to move on. There were moments when I felt invisible, when he looked past me, unsure if he remembered my name or why I was there. And I'd remind myself that memory fades, but care doesn't. Sometimes, love means showing up even when no one remembers you did. One afternoon, he handed me an old photograph. It was of him, younger, sitting on a movie set, hat tilted, that same unshakable look in his eyes. He said softly, "I don't recognize that man anymore." I didn't know what to say. So I told him, "You don't have to. The man you are now, he's earned his peace." He looked at me for a long time, then smiled, the kind of smile that said thank you without words. As months passed, our conversations grew shorter, but our silences grew warmer. I learned to understand him through small gestures. The way he'd nod when I brought him his favorite tea. The way he'd tap the porch railing when the sunset was good that day. We didn't need words anymore. There was something sacred about that quiet understanding. Eventually, he decided to move closer to the ocean. He said he wanted to wake up to waves instead of the creak of old wood. He told me, "This place has too many ghosts. It's time I let them rest." I helped him pack books, scripts, a few framed photos. Before leaving, he stood by the ranch gate one last time, looked around, and whispered, "You kept it alive." I didn't know if he meant the ranch or me. Maybe both. When his car disappeared down the dirt road, I stood there for a long while, letting the dust settle around my feet. It didn't feel like goodbye, more like a quiet pause between two lives that had shared the same sky for a while. Now, it's been years since that day. The ranch still stands, though quieter now. The hills breathe the same dry wind. The sun still spills gold across the wooden fences. And some mornings, I still make 2 cups of coffee. One for me, one for him. Old habits don't fade easily. Sometimes I'll pass by an old movie of his playing on TV. He's younger, their sharp eyes, that half smile, the kind that could silence a whole room. And I sit there watching, thinking how strange it is to have known the man behind that image. The man who could stand strong on screen, but looked for peace and silence when the cameras stopped. He still lives up north. I've heard a friend told me he walks the coastline every morning, same as he used to walk the ranch. Steady, quiet, lost in thought. I don't expect him to remember me anymore. People forget, time softens faces, fades names. But that's okay. Because I remember the mornings we shared coffee and quiet, the way he'd hum under his breath when he thought no one was listening, the way he looked at the sky as if trying to find something only he could see. I learned something from him, something I keep close. That greatness isn't about how many people remember you. It's about the peace you leave behind and the few who do. Sometimes, when I walk by the old stables, I imagine him there feeding the horses. Smiling faintly, saying something simple like, "You did good today." And even though it's just a memory, it still feels real enough to make me smile. We may never speak again, but there's no bitterness in that. Only gratitude for the time shared, for the lessons learned, for the quiet understanding between two souls who once met at the right moment. So I keep going. I take care of the place that once felt alive because of him. And every evening, when the light turns soft and the world feels still, I whisper, "I stayed. Clint, I'm still here." Because sometimes, love isn't about holding on. It's about carrying the memory gently and letting it rest where it belongs. In peace, not pain. Some people don't stay in our lives forever, but the moments they gave us, those stay quietly, like warm light in an old house that never goes dark. For those who remember, even when they're forgotten. Thanks for watching.